So let's go this way. If we take it outside of obvious physiological differences, let's look at some of the similarities first, right? There's a need for an ability to sustain vigilance under different situations and maintain focus. There is an ability and need to be able to respond quickly when called upon, right? In every one of those scenarios.
Right.
Every one of those job demands has a power component and a coordination component. It just may be an issue of how often you have to display that. And there is a huge cognitive component that goes with that as well, right? In terms of decision-making, sort of a go, no-go, but also in terms of performance under pressure and in high stakes situations, right? We often talk about sport and a lot on the line in a championship game or whatever. Not exactly the same as being in a firefight, right? And so, I think that those are things that are similar there. Now, differences. Absolutely. And I think that we would be mistaken to suggest an overall training strategy across all those populations you just named based on that. But if we identify the commonalities in terms of job demands and the ask on those, to me, it's not much different than us classifying sort of sport performance and ergogenic aids, right? If we look at sport nutrition, I'd say by and large, there's some commonalities across all sports in terms of what we'd recommend for people to take, to eat, to do. But we don't necessarily train for all those sports the exact same way. And we don't necessarily fuel for all of them in the same magnitude. So I think once we identify what those underlying components are, it's okay to refer to them as tactical athletes more broadly. And then if we look at it this way, we've got sport athletes, but then we've got soccer players and football players and wrestlers and cyclists and all this stuff. Same thing with tactical athletes. We've got tactical athletes. And then you have first responders like police, you have first responders like police SWAT, you then have firefighters, you then have woodland firefighters, the mountain firefighters, and then you have, even within the military, you certainly have, depending on their MOS, what their job description is and what they need to do. So you've got combat specialties, infantry, artillery. Now we go special forces. And hell, I would even argue between tier 2 and tier 1 special forces. There's a difference that we would have to take into account. So I think it's okay to split it that way and just generally understand the more broad context that we're trying to talk about for performance aspects.
And you did a study, I think it was looking at teacrine and a dynamine supplement?
Teacrine, dynamine, and caffeine combination, correct.
Right.
And we just compared that to...
What you found?
Yeah, so it was actually interesting. We compared that to just all caffeine in the same total dose and then a placebo. And we were interested in, we actually did a vigilance task where they actually had to sustain reaction time task on our Dynavision board for 30 minutes, which I gotta be honest, is pretty mind-blowing.
30 minutes?
30 minutes, because we were trying to simulate is a rough word, but think about somebody being on Overwatch and having to stare through a scope, stay focused on a sort of a target package within a periphery. So we were having them do that. And then we had a physical movement task using our tracer. So we were looking at the ability to move rapidly front to back, side to side, and respond to visual stimuli to do that. And then we also used a target task. So we've got a simulator in our lab for firing, for marksmanship. And so we were able to look at target acquisition in terms of time to target acquisition, accuracy. We even had a reload phase in there where they've got to then change out the magazine and do that stuff. And then we repeated that again. So then they had to go back on Overwatch, do the vigilance task, and move through all this. And what we were also looking at through this was blood pressure, hemodynamic responses, especially blood pressure. So we were looking at heart rate, but also systolic and diastolic blood pressure, because one of the concerns within the military and first responders, given the stress they already incur, is with high caffeine intake, is the effects on hemodynamics, especially diastolic blood pressure and some of the vascular considerations. Right. And so basically what we found is that both of the stimulant conditions, whether it was the caffeine only or the caffeine, teacrine, dynamine, by the time we got to the second round of performance, they were outperforming the placebo group on the reaction time. So during the vigilance task, they identified more correct targets and were moving quicker to them in order to do that. It didn't make a difference for marksmanship, didn't make a difference for movement. And that's fine, because one of the concerns with caffeine and stimulants is it can screw up marksmanship, right? Because of jitteriness, failure on target acquisition. We didn't see that. But what was interesting is between the caffeine and the dynamine, teacrine caffeine combination, there was less hemodynamic perturbation with the combination than with just the caffeine. So caffeine had both an increase in systolic and diastolic relative to placebo. With the other combination, it was only with systolic and it was more modest than the caffeine stimulus. but it was still, the diastolic was no different than placebo. So, but we used about half the dose of caffeine coupled with T-creen and dynamine. So we still got the same performance benefits with less hemodynamic compromise.
What was the caffeine dose for the
300.
300. Okay, maybe that'll wake you up. Tony.
Yeah.
That kickstarts the heart for sure. 30 minutes on dynamine. I've never heard that duration. That's amazing. You better keep these people off of TikTok because they're not going to be very good at that test. And
that's funny.
I mean, anything for 5 seconds, right? That's amazing.
Yeah, and they were great about it. And we used military and first responders in this, especially police, but we also used a lot of ROTC cadets and midshipmen because they're the next generation of the military going into this. So we tried to involve them. That actually, our ROTC group here has been awesome about being involved in some of our research. We have some stuff going on right now with the Air Force for a study we're doing again on caffeine and T-creen, but looking at cognitive performance under fatigue. So now looking at what happens if we run the hell out of these guys and then now all of a sudden they have to respond cognitively. So we're even using some pretty high level cognitive demands in conjunction with Davis Moore, one of my faculty here. And then we're doing some stuff with a device that's supposed to help regulate autonomic nervous system activation. And actually it looks like it might work. I'm kind of really surprised at it, but it's kind of cool. So anyway, so those are some of the ways that we've continued to work with that tactical population.
Quick question.
Go on.
Oh, sorry.
The follow-up question I was just going to ask, might there be any, is there any, with this mix, potentially any age-related variables with that? Like, is a 22-year-old going to get a different effect than a 35-year-old, both being in the military or fire, or do we know, or?
It's a great question, Tony. And so far we have not seen that, you know, but we normally cap it around 35. I think our previous study, it was 40 something. But that's because we're trying to look at like maybe towards end of career of active duty with military where they would still be in the field. But with the study we're doing now, it's up to 35. With that one, it was a broader age group with the T-creen dynamine stuff. But by and large, not much of a difference. And the other thing we were worried about is on the marksmanship task, that we would have a big difference between those in the military and the police versus the ROTC kids. And there actually wasn't. So we're really happy about that because honestly, most of these kids, maybe it's because we're in South Carolina, they have more familiarity with firearms. So it wasn't novel to them, but also a lot of the military and police guys maybe haven't spent a ton of time on the range lately. So you get some of that as well. So it's still that ability to respond when the time comes in order to meet the demands.